I think it's just an odious manifestation, and really it causes rancor and division rather than what it's meant to be doing.
Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. Today the House of Commons will vote on the Assisted Dying Bill, but there's also a government plan perhaps to murder football. The Football Governance Bill is now at the committee stage, having been introduced, and Paul Goodman, who joins us here at the Spectator's office, Paul Goodman of Policy Exchange, he joins us with Rod Liddle, our beloved columnist. Paul, just start off explaining what the Football Governance Bill is, how it came about.
Very simply, the Football Governance Bill is going to, uniquely in Europe, give football a state regulator, right? What will the state regulator do? The state regulator will give clubs a licence in the top 5 leagues, known as the pyramid. It will have, as it were, supervision of their finances, control the flow of the money. This was originally, the money is the main point here, the regulator will do a mass of other things we can discuss. The origins of it lie in a review by Tracy Crouch, former Conservative MP, known for reasons that mystify me as the fan-led review. I don't see why it justifies that title, but we can come back to that later as well. The Conservative government produced a bill based on this report to bring in a state regulator. The Labour government have now taken this up with knobs on. Various peers, mostly Labour, want it to go further. So you kind of think to yourself, football in this country is followed by 33 million people. Only a fraction of them will be aware that a state regulator is coming down the line. And you ask yourself, what could possibly go wrong?
Well, I'll bring Rod in there. What could possibly go wrong, Rod? Because, I mean, I imagine you think that football governance does need some work. It's not a pretty picture.
Well, it doesn't really matter how I feel about it. I mean, I do have certain reservations about the way football, particularly at the top end, is managed. But here you have a perfect example and a kind of perfect storm where something which is exceptionally successful, I mean, it's an exceptionally successful business, which was managing perfectly well all by itself. And the Conservative Party were under Tracy, who was a good thing. Most people agreed that Tracy Crouch was a good sports minister and certainly knew of football, wished to meddle and wished to put a regulator in. And the Labour government, which we have at the moment, wishes to go even further. In other words, the intention is to kind of demolish the structure which I opposed back in the early 90s, but which has proved extraordinarily successful. And by the structure, what I mean is the creation of the Premier League and having Premier League football filmed every single game, pretty much. I argued in 1991, to nobody in particular, but to friends down the pub, that this would be the death of football, that people wouldn't turn up to the grounds. Don't forget, we just ended the 80s when attendances were at an all-time low, partly as a consequence of hooliganism, partly as a consequence of the awful football on show, and the fact that Britain was miles behind the continent. So we were miles behind the continent, and there was football hooliganism, attendances at an all-time low, and we bring in the Premier League. And what happens? Attendances do not go down. They not merely increase, but they increase to levels never previously seen. So you may argue that this involves the bourgeoisification of football, or as I prefer to call it, the Charltonification of football. But nonetheless, the success has been beyond belief. That our clubs are now incredibly successful in Europe, and we get to see the best players in the world playing in our domestic league, which is accepted pretty much as the best league in the world. You know, no one really comes close. So we could all argue about, but it's also surely this will also harm the Championship and the leagues below the Premier League. No, it's done the opposite. It's done the opposite of what I expected as a chippy little lefty. It's done exactly the opposite. The attendances in the Championship are up so far that I think it's the third highest watched league in Europe. It's had a rejuvenating effect all the way down to the National League, where attendances are again higher, much, much higher than they were in the fourth tier back in the 80s and 90s. So it's been incredibly successful. And I suppose it's the case that when things are incredibly successful, people want to legislate and to regulate and to put put some sort of I think what they're trying to do is to level up. Right. And to make sure that more money gets through to the poorer clubs, which, of course, as someone who supports a poorer club, Millwall, I would like to see happen. But one of the crucial things that the Premier League did is indeed about that. And I think the Premier League should give more money to the poorer clubs, so I do agree with that. But one of the things the Premier League has done, which has been brilliant, is the way it apportions the money out within the Premier League, which has been very, very cannily handled indeed. You don't get that much more for winning the league than you do for staying in it, you know? And as a consequence, that means an awful lot of money has been passed around an ever-widening array of clubs, and that percolates down the divisions. So it's a real problem, I think. And, of course, FIFA have suggested that we won't be able to host any more tournaments and be kicked out of various tournaments if we bring in a regulator, because they don't like anyone meddling with their clearly mafioso style of operating.
On that last point, by the way, UEFA have written a letter to ministers about the implications of the state basically having oversight of football in the UK. Karen Brady, who's a peer as I am, challenged the minister about this last night in the Lords, asked if the letter would be published. The minister won't publish the letter. That's been taken up today, and I'm expecting that to get more publicity. Just picking up on what Rod said. Rod has been following football for years, more closely than I have and across more divisions. I'm a season ticket holder at Wycombe Wanderers. I have been now for about 10 years. But what struck me reading the Crouch report was it didn't start from this premise of success that Rod has just described. It mentioned three things as the trigger for the report. The first was COVID. Okay, you can't do anything about that. The second was the collapse of Bury. I read this report and thought, hang on a sec, of course, Bury did collapse. And this was a huge problem in, an industrial town in the provinces in which the club's integral to its identity, but Bury resurrected. So, hang on a sec, wasn't the problem solved? It also cited the Super League, but the Super League didn't happen. And when you read through the report, it focused on the problems like, the famous closure of Wimbledon and Wimbledon's movement up to Milton Keynes as MK Dons. But it didn't really dwell on the successes or the other side of the balance, which, for example, is, I've been there, Wimbledon sort of resurrected itself. It got itself going again. And, it's back there in the leagues. So there is a lot of politics in this, in the pure sense of almost political philosophy, in that if you talk to the Premier League, the Premier League's view is a kind of like trickle down. It's what Rod's just described. It's we're a success and our success basically works, and it basically works for the rest of the pyramid. If you talk to the people who are in favour of the bill lower down the pyramid, they're preoccupied with the gaps between the divisions. There's a lot of to and fro about the parachute payments that teams get when they come down out of the Premiership. So there's an interesting kind of philosophical divide here. It's whether you let the system work in its rough and ready way, which teams sometimes do get into trouble, and they're sometimes run by very bad people, or whether you go the whole hog and you bring in a state regulator with all the consequences of having a regulator. I mean, regulators are not automatically popular or efficient people. Only this week, a Commons committee, for what it's worth, has just slated the Financial Standards Authority. What is going to happen? And, Tom Watson, the controversial Labour peer, former Labour MP, made a brilliant speech about all this last night. What's going to happen when the government literally is seen by the fans to own football? It's all very well saying ministers won't be in charge. I mean, that didn't work with the post office, doesn't work with blood transfusion, didn't go work with Hillsborough. If all this doesn't work, people are going to be queuing up at minister's door. And as you know, we like to say in our internal Tory meetings, we want to make Starmer responsible for each VAR decision, right? That'll teach him for getting involved in the game.
Paul's right. I mean, it was seen from the bottom end of the pyramid, and as you quite rightly mentioned, Bury. But there was a report out in, I think it was 2004, 2005, for a quiet report from the Football League, saying that 7 or 8 largely northwestern football clubs would probably go out of business within the next 20, 25 years. And that's kind of exactly what has happened. But as has been said, they've all reconvened. There are new clubs in Macclesfield, Chester, Bury, I think Rochdale, Darlington, up in my part of the wood. So that hasn't quite happened as they expected it to happen. The other thing that's happened, and Wickham is a good example of this, and this is nothing to do with the Football League pyramid and the money that the Premier League has, but there has been a tilt over the last 25 to 30 years away from the areas which invented football, you might argue, the northwest, parts of the northeast, towards areas of affluence in the south and southeast, which is why we have the appalling prospect of Bournemouth, for example, in the top division, and Brighton, and lots of London clubs, and coming up on the rails, Reading were a Premier League club, which, you go back 40 years would have been unthinkable. And Wycombe Wanderers, who are doing very, very well for themselves. These are pockets of areas with a young, youthful population which is earning money and where football is turning out to be very popular. And I could see a Premier League in 10 years' time, which has got Wycombe and Reading and Portsmouth and Southampton and Brighton and Bournemouth in it. But I think that's different to the regulator thing. Yeah, I disagree with parachute payments greatly, enormously. I also disagree with VAR. I think it's ruining the game. And I do think that more money could be put through to what we call the grassroots. But the trouble is, when you look at my record, I've been wrong about everything. I was absolutely wrong about the Premier League. We now have a greatly improved England team. We watch these wonderful players every week playing for our top sides, and it is extraordinarily successful. So I think the lesson is not to take any notice of me.
I always take notice of you, Rod. I think that perhaps you were right, but it's taking a long time for you to be proved right. If we look at something like ownership of clubs, I understand that there are rules in place to stop bad ownership, but it hasn't worked, has it?
You can get a free bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label Whiskey when you subscribe to The Spectator in our Black Friday sale. Go to spectator.co.uk/Friday24.
The most popular sort of part of the bill is Part 4, which seeks to vet rogue owners, though I don't think the bill that's empowering anyone to go and look at the owners that are already there. But you didn't necessarily have to have a state regulator to do that. By the way, just picking up on Rod's point about all these southern teams doing well. I think the other point here, of course, is proximity to London. If you are a sort of big kind of sort of foreign buyer and you want to net in, it's why I always thought Wycombe were very well positioned. Hey, you're only half an hour down the M40 in the kind of land where, people dash off to rural churches to film episodes of Poirot because it's a kind of nice, convenient distance from Shepherd's Bush. Why not go in and buy a team? But look, if Rod and I are wrong, my simple test is really this. I've put down an amendment to the bill, which is a sunset clause. So after 5 years, you have a review. And the review might say, we will tinker with the system and do this and that. Or the review might say it's not working at all. So, the theory goes that, you've got a chance to look at the whole thing in 5 years, whereas at the moment, there's no mechanism at all to review it, other than, of course, one that will lie in the hands of ministers.
That sounds very good. That sounds a very good idea. I mean,
They won't accept it for a moment, of course.
But it is ever the case, isn't it, that when something is hugely successful, as football has been, that everyone wants a part of it and believes it's being run badly, whereas all the evidence is to the contrary. The question about ownership of clubs, there is effectively no bar on anyone, if we're honest. I mean, if Thaxton Water can be able to take over a club, then there really is no bar for anybody. And I think it's disingenuous to pretend that there is a fit and proper test, even if they insist that fit and proper simply means they've got enough dosh in their back pocket. And there's no question either that the four divisions are plagued by, I would say, 1/3 of the club, maybe 1/4, have got truly awful owners. But I don't really see a way out of that. And the experiments we've had with the fans controlling clubs hasn't been terribly good most of the time, except at the very, very lowest level.
Is there not a problem, though, Paul, with clubs and debt? I mean, a lot of clubs are extremely over-leveraged financially, and the very, very rich owners don't necessarily bail them out.
It depends how you look at it. I mean, one speaker in the second reading of the Lords said he'd been through the accounts of the last 21 years and found only 3 clubs were up in the Premier League were properly solvent, and they were Bournemouth, Brentford, and someone else beginning with B that I can't remember. Rod would probably have it. But that raises quite a big question about debt, because from one point of view, the whole system could go tomorrow because of all this debt. And you need this sort of state regulator to come in and save football from itself. But from another point of view, hate tomorrow is mañana. And it has ever been thus. These clubs are loaded with debt, but the whole system carries on successfully. Is it really worth taking the risk with a regulator? So here's something that could happen as a result of having the regulator. You may not think it's the worst thing in the world, but I think it's an interesting kind of consequence of having it. These championship teams are loaded up with debt, most of them, in order to try to get up in the Premiership. What's going to happen when the regulator comes in and says to such and such a championship team, you're running up a bit of debt there, we think you should reduce your debt? What will the club do? The club will turn around and say, well, we can't afford to buy any more players, or we have to sell our players because of the regulator, right? What are the fans going to do then? Are they going to blame the club, or are they going to blame the regulator? And I think it's quite likely they will blame the regulator. And they may not stop at the door of the regulator. They may say, who appoints the regulator? It's the politicians. And I've been amazed, and this is the point that Tom Watson made very forcefully and eloquently during the debate this week. He said, hey, here's football, the most controversial thing in the land. Everyone's got a view on it. And ministers are lining up to take responsibility for this. Are we crazy?
Well, the answer is obviously yes.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And I mean, the other thing about the Championship, you're absolutely right. The Championship is the danger league. That is where clubs who believe they have a beholden right to be in the top division spend too much money, and they kind of flirt with oblivion, and yet they don't actually go bust. So we've seen it with Leeds United, famously, with Nottingham Forest, with Wigan, with Bolton, with Charlton, with all these clubs, loads of clubs, all of whom Derby County have overspent to try to get themselves into the Premier League. And all that's happened to them is, yes, they go bust, they go into administration, and they have a salutary few years in the 3rd tier, or even in some cases the 4th tier, and later they're back, and nothing changes. So even that, there seems to be a means that these clubs are regulated without the need for a regulator.
That's absolutely bang on. I mean, at Wickham, I've seen Derby, I've seen Portsmouth this season, I've seen Birmingham, or we'll see Birmingham when they come. And Rod's right, they tend to go back up. I've seen us play Derby. Derby have gone up. Portsmouth were, Rod will know all about Portsmouth's troubled history, because I think they've been right down in Division 2. But they've gone back up. Clubs do seem to have, to a remarkable degree, a way of sort of resurrecting and reviving themselves, even when they look as though they're on the floor.
But, I mean, there is a good case, is there not, that the Premier League has become so rich, so impossibly rich, that television money is so enormous, that inevitably the Championship becomes this very difficult league, as Rod calls it. And then the clubs and the leagues below are economic basket cases to a certain extent as a result.
Well, there's a case for it, but the question is what's going to happen when the regulator gets the regulator's teeth in. Now, the government says the regulator's responsibilities will be quite minimal. Don't worry. We will keep it to vetting bad owners, and we will make sure the flow of money is fairer. But these peers, as MPs will be lining up to put amendments down. We want, the regulator to have a net zero responsibility. We want them to have a responsibility for the environment. Diversity and inclusion and equality are, of course, already there. There are calls to make the regulator responsible for women's football, for Premier League North, for the Premier League South, and all that. So it only takes a change of minister or a change of heart by the administration for the regulator to expand. And you've only got to have one bad regulator, just one, who decides that they're going to interfere here or there without the knowledge to really put a spanner in the game.
Well, that's another part of your piece, Paul, that's I think very important. We should talk about is the diversity stuff that's already in the legislation. There will be an attempt for politicians to do politically correct tinkering with football.
Mind you, of course, the clubs are all into that anyway. And in many ways, the way fans reacted is not the way that some people would necessarily expect. I mean, I think in the last few years, the great sort of anti-woke triumph, if you like, has been the sort of collapse of the Nicola Sturgeon position in Scotland over trans. The great sort of cause of some people on the right who had a gleam in their eye was kind of taking a knee and all that. But my experience on the whole is crowds have at the very least tolerated that and up to a point kind of applauded it. I think there were sort of pockets of resistance and booing. Rod will correct me if I'm wrong about this.
I think there was booing wherever it happened initially. And then when you had the immense propaganda, and this was at a time of lockdown, remember, when there weren't the usual channels for debating stuff around. So the first booing happened in America. I think it was Dallas Cowboys or one of the Dallas teams was playing and took the knee and everyone booed. Then it happened over here, it happened at Middlesbrough, and of course, famously, it happened at my club, Millwall, and I was absolutely delighted and took part in the booing myself. And I think it only really died out, the booing, when the fury and the propaganda became so loud and people were told they'd be kicked out of grounds and stuff. I think it's just been tolerated. But I don't think I take on board the problems as well that are suggested that a regulator could indeed get themselves involved in all that stuff. And again, the Championship, I was a bit wrong about that, I think, as well. My fear was, as you put it, Freddie, that you would get a bigger and bigger divide between the Championship and the top division. That hasn't happened. You are getting a bit of a divide within the Championship between those clubs which have been in the top division and those who haven't. But that's largely a consequence of parachute payments. If you were able to get rid of the parachute payments, then I think, the Championship would continue to be what, for my mind, is the most exciting league in the country. If you look back to last season, and this is all from memory, but I seem to remember that at some point, even when we were into March, there's something like 10 clubs that could get themselves into the playoffs. It's very hard to say that the division has become that it's far harder to get promoted these days. It kind of isn't. Tends to be true that, and it's tending to be more true, that the clubs that go up tend to be the ones that come down. And there is some argument, a quiet argument put about, that this has become a sort of rather lucrative business model for the likes of Burnley, Norwich and so on, who go up, cop the 120 million quid, come back down, don't go bust, go up a few years later, and that's very, very lucrative indeed. But it's not really affecting the Championship.
Given that the Premier League and other leagues are quite vulnerable to wokeness. They seem to be quite into imposing it on fans. What would you say to a kind of Trumpian approach to this subject, which would be a football governing body? Of course, we'll never get it in Britain, but a football governing body that banned clubs from.
It's almost impossible to imagine. I must say, my impression of what happened with Black Lives Matter, the booing and the cheering, is it's different to Rod's. His is probably more extensive, and it's probably true that the media generally would not have accentuated, would not have amplified reports of the booing. I'm just saying it kind of wasn't my experience. Of course, a great factor in all this is that, and I don't know the percentage, but the striking thing, if you go to a game in the pyramid and you watch the teams, is a very large proportion of the players are black, much larger than the percentage of black people in the general population. The proportion of Asian players from sort of, say, an Indian Pakistani origin in High Wycombe, a town that would be 20% Asian Pakistani Kashmiri in origin, is just about zero. So actually, I think the fact that so many players were black had a huge impact on Black Lives Matter and the sort of levels of noise within the game and what players said and how that would have communicated itself to management and then to the boards. So I find it almost impossible to imagine some kind of Trumpian body unless, maybe you put Rod in charge of it.
There were quite a few black players who very, very bravely, frankly, put their heads above the parapet and said, this is odious, condescending, and we don't want any of it. Lyle Taylor, when he was at Charlton, and Wilfried Zaha as well at Crystal Palace, two clubs I don't have an enormous affection for, but nonetheless, they both put their heads above the parapet. I think in a way it's less about football, isn't it, than about corporate wokeness. And it would seem to me that the DEI stuff is beginning to retreat. It's certainly in full retreat in America, with Walmart now tearing up everything to do with DEI it ever signed up to. And I know from talking to chairmen of a few football clubs in this country that they're sick of it. They felt compelled to do it, and they're not going to do it anymore. I think the worst thing about this season has been the return of taking the knee. I think it's just an odious manifestation, and really it causes rancor and division rather than what it's meant to be doing.
Well, lastly, I'll ask you both, starting with you, Paul. What do you think will happen with the football governance bill?
I think the bill will go through. So we will have the regulator, and then we will have to see. I suspect my biggest worry is not that you have immediate problems with the regulator, but about 3 or 4 or 5 years down the line, you get the wrong one. You get Labour MPs in particular, but it won't just be confined to Labour, playing up to the regulator and demanding more and more powers, and that you have a kind of strangulation of some of the best in football. That's my worry, but whether it happens or it doesn't, a sunset clause would be a very good idea, so you can look at the whole thing in a few years and see where it's gone.
I think that's incredibly sensible. I'm very grateful you're there to say it. I think there will be initial problems, and those initial problems will come with the European and world bodies of football, which do not like this kind of thing. And I think, if anything, it will probably persuade the likes of Chelsea and Arsenal and Liverpool and Man United and inconceivably, I don't know why, Tottenham Hotspur are always talked about as being one of the big clubs. So the last one is something, I think, in 1962. It will encourage them to make more forays abroad, frankly, because they will be wishing to get themselves out from under the neck of a regulator. So I can't see anything but trouble coming from it, even though initially, I was probably in favour of the idea.
Rod and Paul, thank you very much indeed.